This is the presentation how Fervo builds web apps. I'm Magnus Nordlander. I'm a PHP consultant, and I'm also the CEO of Fervo, which is a small, well, I've worked with PHP for well over 10 years, and I've specialized sort of in Symfony, which I worked with for about 9 years now. I actually had to check on the Sensio Labs Connect site to see which badge I had, and I was pleasantly surprised, not to make me feel old or anything. So Fervo is a small consultancy. We specialize in modern PHP, and we do have a lot of Symfony skills, but modern PHP isn't just Symfony, it's just a lot of Symfony. With 3 PHP consultants, and 2 of us are Symfony certified, and you can read more about us at fervo.se. Enough with the plugging. So I'm going to talk, well, I mean, it's going to be sort of plugging all the entire talk, because I'm talking about how we build apps. So what I'm going to be talking about is sort of like a technology radar here. I'm going to be talking about our tech stack, I'm going to be talking about the development methodology which we use, and I'm also going to be talking about the software architecture that we like to use in projects. Of course, being consultants, we don't always get to pick, but when we do get to pick, we tend to pick things from this presentation. After that, I'm gonna, if there's time, we'll see. I haven't actually timed this presentation before, so it might be interesting. If there's time, there's going to be some sort of a demo. I'm just going to show you a project, an internal project that we have that uses some of these principles, not all, because it's an old project. And after that, I suppose there's going to be time for questions. I hope so, at least. A small caveat, a preface here. I'm going to introduce a lot of concepts here. Some of them I'm going to delve more deeply into. Some of them I'm going to more like skim over. And for most of them, I could probably spend a 45-minute talk talking about just those features. So it's going to be sort of a wide talk, not that deep. My goal here is to pique your interest in some of these things, so that you want to learn more and can go home and look them up. First off, no, not first off. Another caveat is that some of these things work better for larger projects. If you have a small project, you don't need that much structure. Whereas if you have a big project, you tend to need more structure. If you're just one developer, you don't need as much structure as if you're a team of developers. And your mileage may vary here. Some of these things we wouldn't even do if it's a small enough project. It depends, which is the consultant's answer to everything. Yeah, for a pretty large project, we would be using most of these. Okay. Yes, the technology radar. We would like to look at things in terms of maturity. So some things we generally recommend for pretty much every project. Other things, or not necessarily every project, but generally recommend as a solution to a particular problem. Some things we think are very promising, and we're trying them out either ourselves or with customers. We wouldn't recommend them to just about everyone, but it could be called for to use, and those are under trial, basically. Promising projects are promising, that is, they are more than just interesting, but we haven't had the time to actually use them in a production environment. They're probably ready to be tried, to be trialed internally, and interesting projects are just interesting. They're basically the kind of projects that you star on GitHub because they look cool. Not something you would necessarily want to use in production, but interesting to keep a lookout for. So let's start with the tech stack. I assume most people here who do dev work in PHP. I mean, this is a PHP meetup. And we would generally recommend using PHP 7 because the old versions of PHP are going to be go the way of the dodo soon. So PHP 7 is generally recommended. There is some very interesting developments in parts of the community. Something that I particularly enjoyed looking at is something called subset PHP. It's a small project that takes PHP, they want to run it on LLVM, and they want to strip out lots of old stuff. So that's interesting, because make PHP smaller, that's cool. That's never going to happen in PHP 7 pretty much, because that would be a huge backward compatibility break. So that's never going to happen. But it's interesting as a separate project. But it's nowhere near ready to use, it's just interesting. HHVM has been an interesting topic for a long time. And HHVM is sort of production ready. However, with PHP 7, and especially with things coming now in PHP 7.1 and hopefully in 7.1 or 7.2, there's going to be less of a need to run HHVM because PHP 7 is catching up on performance. And when it comes to features for typing, like in Hacklang, HHVM used to have a huge edge. PHP 7 is sort of catching up, hopefully. So here's hoping. But HHVM is certainly possible to run in production. We just don't do it yet. We probably never will if PHP 7 works out well. For servers, there's really nothing to run but Linux. That's pretty much the only option. And for databases, we prefer Postgres, because I hate MySQL. Even though I do hate it, it's fine too. But seriously, if you get the choice, use Postgres. If you don't get the choice, yeah, you can do things with MySQL, and it's stable and proven, but I just don't like it. Also on the topic of other database engines, Redis is awesome. If you want a key value store, there's several mature document-oriented databases like MongoDB, like CouchDB. The thing is, though, I mean, they all work slightly differently. You can even do some document-oriented things in Postgres, which is interesting because that's also ACID compliant. Your choice there is going to depend on your use case, but there's lots of interesting things to use. Elasticsearch is awesome for searching. It's slightly useful as it's useful as a document database as well, because you can basically do anything you can in like MongoDB in Elasticsearch as well, and it's quite similar. Plus it has really, really fast full-text searching, which is awesome. We also love Heroku. We deploy pretty much everything we do internally on Heroku because it's simple and I don't have to do a lot of system administration, which I do not like to do. AWS is pretty awesome as well. So what we tend to do if we get to choose is we deploy PHP using Heroku, and then we use AWS for some other services like RDS, their database engine is great, and Heroku actually is hosted on AWS, so it's low latency. Just make sure to pick the right Heroku region, that is EU here if you want to use EU West for AWS. So those two work really well together. For development, we're using Docker. And we're using Docker in sort of an interesting fashion, because we usually, things like database servers or Redis or whatever, those we run inside Docker, whereas PHP we tend to run locally. And then we just reference the Docker machine for the database or whatnot. That's great, especially if you're a consultant and you have to go to different projects and you need to use different versions of MySQL or different versions of Elasticsearch, and you can all just put them in one Docker Compose file, and then you don't have to keep installing and uninstalling different versions of your dependencies. That's just a pain. So definitely Docker and Docker Compose for development is great. I did have an opportunity to just the last few days try out the new Docker for Mac beta. It's pretty smooth. It works well, sort of. The problem really for us as Symfony developers is that the performance is horrible for file systems. And Symfony, especially when using the dev environment, tends to touch a lot of files. So we're talking multiple second rendering times, which is not fast enough. But that's just in beta. That's the latest one I tried was beta 11. Hopefully, before it's released, they will have magically fixed performance. I don't know. I hope, because it's a big disappointment if they don't. Yeah. Docker in production, we haven't actually tried yet. One of our clients is moving towards it, and it's going to be very interesting to see it work. I have high hopes for Docker in production. We also generally recommend, speaking of PHP again, we also generally recommend using PHP FPM, not mod PHP, because PHP FPM is generally faster, it's generally better with conserving CPU power, not necessarily memory, but it's generally faster, and you can do more things with PHP FPM. You can scale separately with PHP FPM, and it's not tied into Apache, which, I mean, we're usually not using Apache as a web server anyway. So that's pretty cool. There have been some very interesting developments in the PHP community for a long time. I remember actually back in, it has to be back in 2011, in the early 2.0 versions of Symfony 2. And I started looking into a project called App Server, I think. And also Leech, which is one of the interesting projects here, is basically from around back then. The entire point of these projects is to serve HTTP requests from within PHP, because a lot of time in, say, a Symfony application or any modern application, you're going to be spending that time auto-loading and basically making sure every class you're using is loaded. And that's time that could be better spent serving requests. So the idea with these systems is basically you start serving your HTTP requests or FPM requests internally. And if you're using something like Symfony, which has the HTTP kernel, takes a request, returns a response, that's not too different from what you'd be doing anyway. The problem is that none of these things are really mature. So Leech, which uses 0MQ, is supposedly really fast. It also hasn't updated for 4 years. And it's not nearly production ready. I would discount that one. React PHP is interesting because that's been developing for quite a while now. It sort of gets into trouble because PHP code is usually not written to work well with React. For example, the MySQL extension is blocking. So the way they're handling concurrency is it might work if you're doing a small application which is really meant to be React compatible. I would probably not recommend it for a full-sized application. PHP PM is also interesting. It's basically a PHP process manager which uses React, sort of like PHP FPM. The way PHP FPM works is it starts a pool of PHP processes, and then once you get a request, you get assigned one of the processes, and you use that to process your request. This does the same with React pretty much, and I think that would solve the blocking issues. PHP PM is not at version 1.0 yet. It could be interesting if it becomes, if it goes that far. There's also PHP Fast CGI, which basically takes the different approach well, basically it takes the same approach, but it does it with Fast CGI instead, which is what PHP FPM does. It just cuts out the entire request initialization. So don't use them yet. Feel free to try them out. It's interesting to keep an eye on them, because if we get something that's stable and usable, that's going to be increasing your performance something like, I don't know, by 5 times, possibly an order of magnitude. It's that much faster. Also, of course, depending on the size of your application, but your mileage may vary. That's it about the tech stack. I want to go into the development methodology that we like to use now. And basically, we're not big believers in the waterfall model, because the only constant really when you're developing software is change. And the waterfall model isn't really made for change. So generally we use some sort of an agile methodology. There's been sort of an inflation in saying that we're agile, we're doing things the agile way, which could be anything from truly being agile to having stand-up meetings every morning, which does not really help unless you're doing the rest of the things. We also generally recommend using BDD, both story BDD and spec BDD. And I'm going to get into those a bit closer. The key for any development process is communication and collaboration. That's basically what the idea behind agile development, agile methodology is all about. You need to talk to your customers, you need to talk to the product owners. And I found an interesting tweet on this very topic just a couple of days ago. This guy obviously holds workshops, and so when he has a workshop with devs only, we can't change because of business. If it's business only, we can't change because of development, always. And that reflects a lot of companies, I believe. A lot of times there's a lot of conflict between development and business because, well, you don't really see what you're doing, and you're not communicating properly usually. So communication is key, and that's enough of the multi-level marketing speak here. So BDD, who here has heard of BDD? Quite a few, okay, that's good. BDD is behavior-driven development. It's sort of like, who here has heard of TDD? More people. It's sort of TDD done right. So TDD was an early component of a lot of agile. When a lot of teams started being agile, they started doing TDD. And TDD is good, but what happened is basically once people started using TDD, some people started using it in a way that wasn't ideal, let's put it. So BDD is sort of taking TDD and doing it right. So you're taking TDD, questions in the end of the...
Yes, it's not a question, but when you use shorts, please spell them out at least once.
They will, yeah. Yes, true. I did spell out, no I didn't, okay, so TDD is test-driven development. DDD is domain-driven design. And basically, BDD is TDD and domain-driven design and object-oriented analysis and design. All put together, and then you get BDD. So a lot of people pay lip service to testing, but BDD gives you, because, I mean, of course you're testing at least something, like you have tests. At least you have PHP unit as a requirement in your composer file, right? Yeah, so you're testing, sort of, you're in the process, and usually it's because testing is hard, right? Using BDD gives you immediate benefits to actually start doing testing. So that makes it easier to adopt for yourself and for the business side, because oftentimes, I assume pretty much everyone has been in this situation, there is the question of why do we really need testing? It's going to take a lot of time, isn't it? And couldn't we just test later? BDD actually gives you some concrete advantages that makes it easier to sell, basically. So that makes it easier to adopt. Story BDD, which is one of the two, basically BDD can be chopped up into Story BDD and Spec BDD. So Story BDD is basically a way of capturing business requirements in a testable format. And they are written in the business-readable, ubiquitous language. Bayhot is a great tool for using Story BDD. It's very mature. Make sure to use version 3 because that's much better than version 2. So how does a Story BDD business requirement or test or whatnot look like? Usually it's written in Gherkin, which is basically a way to how to write English or any other language. I'm going to be using examples here from who here flies a lot, or at least enjoys gathering frequent flyer miles. So, some of you do. So that's basically the scenario I'm going to be using here. So if you're having a frequent flyers program, one of the features that you might want to have is advancing to a higher status. Because for those of you who don't know how frequent flyer programs work, is you get a bunch of points, and if you get enough points, you get higher status. And if you get higher status, you get perks. So it's a reason to fly more. So one of the things you want to do is you want to advance to a higher status. So that's the feature. That's just the name of the feature. And then you describe it so you know why you're having it. In this case, as a frequent flyer program member, whenever I collect enough points, I want to be moved up to a higher status. And then we have these interesting and syntax highlighted part of this particular feature. Given I am FFP is frequent flyer program. Given I am a frequent flyer program member, and I have been given status in the frequent flyer and I have a given status in the frequent flyer program, and there is a higher status in the frequent flyer program. When I fly a flight, giving me enough points to pass the threshold to the higher status, then I should be moved up to that status. And what Bayhot does is basically it allows you to parse this file and translate this into code that can be run to test whether or not this works. And it does, I'm not going to say it's painless, because it's not, because it's a lot of text parsing, and you actually have to write code to make each of these statements here work. But it's very, very worth it to have scenarios that business people can actually read and can understand. So whenever there's a new feature, you should be able to actually produce one of these feature files for that feature with the business people. They will understand it and you will understand it, and there won't be a lot of miscommunications. And if you want to change things, well, everyone understands this. It's perfectly possible to change them. So that's how Story BDD works. And I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to show you how to actually implement this, but I've already spent like 15 minutes or more, I think. And I'm only on slide 21. So Spec BDD is sort of the counterpart to Story BDD, where Story BDD works with business goals and how the application works in general and can be used for acceptance testing. Spec BDD works for the smaller class-focused scope. So basically, a spec is what specifies what a class does and how it interacts with other classes. There's a great tool called PHP spec, which is quite a hard ass on you. You probably don't want to start using PHP spec to spec out your existing classes unless you've been really, really good at following solid. Solid is, of course, a big acronym that's, well, lots of quality code things. It's a pain in the ass to use PHP spec if you're not following solid. And that's good, because that means that if you're using PHP spec, you're gonna be following solid. And following solid makes your code better. It's the single responsibility principle, it's the open-closed principle, the Liskov substitution principle, it's interface segregation, and dependency inversion. All of those 5 things, I'm not going to go into more closely what they are, I just wanted to spell out the acronym. All of those things make for quality code, and if you're using something like PHP spec, it's a pain in the ass not to actually do those things. That's good. And that's all about development methodology. Now, software architecture. This is where the beef of the presentation is. So one of the ideas that we have is that your domain code is basically at the center of your application. When you're using a web framework like Symfony or Laravel or whatever you're using, that's for integrating your domain code with the web. Your domain code stands alone. You also have, Symfony has many things. Symfony provides a web framework. Symfony also provides a command line interface, command line tool. That part of Symfony is not a web framework, it's a CLI framework. And that's for giving your domain code a CLI interface, just as the web part is for giving your domain code a web interface. But the important part is your domain code. Domain code is basically the code that solves your problem domain. So if you're, again, taking the frequent flyer program as an example, that's where all the rules for how you work with points, what a member is, what do we store about members, all of those things are going to be in your domain code. Things like, well, what's the, how do we convert an ID to a member? That's sort of not really that interesting. Well, of course you're going to have a repository, but that's more of a web concern because otherwise you wouldn't be passing around IDs anyway. So generally we like to see that domain code is written sort of like a library, and that sort of means that you are responsible for structuring your own domain code. If you go into a project that's written in Symfony or that's written in Laravel, usually you find a lot of people are trying to fit their code into the mold of that particular project, into the mold of Symfony or into the mold of Laravel. And that's not what we prefer, because that means you're writing your code for the framework. That's not what we advocate. You would be writing your code separately, and then you're adding the framework afterwards. So we also generally recommend using command query separation, which means that code that's used for fetching data or reading data pretty much should not be the same code that's used for storing data or making changes. The reason behind that is basically you get better code is usually command query separated. There's less of a chance of bugs if you can't actually change the data you're using. And generally it's different concerns anyways. Events is awesome. Commands and events are messages, and I'm going to go into messages pretty immediately here, I think. No? You can tell that I've been adding things to this presentation quite recently. So when you start writing your domain code, basically what you want to do is you want to start at least looking at what am I writing? And the approach we prefer is to use the DDD, domain-driven design approach. So you analyze your project, you're modeling your project's domain, and then you create that sort of model. That results in a number of entities, a number of value objects, aggregates, domain events, services, repositories, and factories usually. And those are pretty much the only sort of code you should be having in your domain code.
But entity would then be a read model and a write model.
Yes. Or not necessarily. I mean, you don't necessarily have a write model. So event storming is something that's another interesting part of writing your domain code. Basically, that is, you take a look at the entire problem domain and you consider, so what sort of things can happen here? So if we have a frequent flyer program, one of the events is a user flies a flight. One of the events is a user gets points. Another event is a new year passes, or not necessarily a year, but the membership year passes, or a user signs up, or a user leaves the program. Basically, an event storming is an opportunity to take all of these different business events, put them onto post-it notes, and make sure you know every event that's in your domain, because that's going to make things a lot easier when it comes to modeling your domain. We've never had the opportunity to actually do event storming, but it looks really cool, so we want to. So messages. Imagine you're the Emperor of Rome. I don't actually know if the Emperor of Rome had sort of a throne room or anything, but if I was the Emperor of Rome, I would have a throne room, and I would make sure my throne is pretty damn comfortable. So I would sit there, and I would prefer to sit there. I don't want to leave the palace unnecessarily. So whenever my Roman army has conquered a new territory, I need to be informed I'm the Emperor. So I get a message, like a scroll, that says, "Congratulations, you've conquered some part of what used to be Rome. You conquered Iberia, congratulations." That's a message. And that particular message is an event. You conquered Iberia. And let's say there's a rebellion in Germania. What do? Of course, you need to have the Roman peace so you can trade. Well, you quash that rebellion, so you send out orders to your governor to quash them. And that probably goes down into a scroll, which is handed off to someone who runs away with that message. And that's a message. That's a command. So there's different kinds of messages. The ones that are most useful in this context is, in fact, events and commands. And they mainly differ in their intent. So an event is an informative message. It's informative in nature, and it can be passed to anyone who is interested in it. There should not be any sort of silliness about event propagation that can be stopped or mutating the events. Events should be immutable. Well, every message should be immutable. And commands, on the other hand, are imperative in nature. That is, they are an order. Do this. And they're only passed to the respective command handler. There's only one chance of, there's exactly one handler for a command. Why? Well, I have an interesting quote here from The Office. Who likes The Office? Well, surprisingly few people. That means you probably haven't heard this. So look, it doesn't take a genius to know that any organization thrives when it has two leaders. Go ahead, name a country that doesn't have two presidents, a boat that sets sail without two captains. Where would Catholicism be without the popes? So no, only one handler for a command, please. It's going to be difficult enough. So messages are just small PHP class instances that you can pass around. They should, like I said, immutability is king. If they're not immutable, you're going to have problems, sort of like how events are in JavaScript, where they can be stopped, or events in Symfony, which are not really events. I don't like those. No, they should be immutable. You should not be able to change an event once it's been created. It should contain all the information that's required, and you should not be able to change them. And messages do not have return values. Again, go back to the scrolls. It's not like somebody scribbles something on the back of the scroll, sending it back. That's not how it works. You could possibly get, as a response to an event, you could get a command, or as a response to a command, that's very common actually to emit a new event saying that, well, this has happened. As we will see on next slide, not this one. To handle a message, we usually use a message bus. And commands are handled by a command bus, and there's exactly one handler per command. And events are handled by an event bus. There's 0 or more event listeners. We use SimpleBus, which is a message bus library written by Matthias Novak. And messages and handlers are just your own PHP classes. There's nothing special about them, really. And SimpleBus also supports asynchronous message passing, which is great, but it does impose some difficult requirements, so make sure to read up on it before you get into it, but it's pretty cool. We're using it in some projects. So this member completed flight is an event. It informs us that a member has now completed a flight. And it's not the exact, can everyone see the code well?
Yeah.
Good. That's why I made it huge and actually didn't paste in the final method. But it's just a class. It's a regular PHP object. It takes a member and a flight, and then you have a getter for members and the flight. That's it. That's the event. No setters, no changing anything. You could, if you want to, you could add validation here. That's perfectly fine. But no mutating the event. So what do we do when the event has been handled? Well, we have this beautiful class, which I think might be difficult to read because I can barely read it here. It's called when member completed flight, add frequent flyer miles. This is also something that we do prefer when it comes to event handlers, to have the naming structure of when and then the event and then what are we doing. So in this case, when member completed flight, add frequent flyer miles. So this is just another PHP class. The important method really is the notify method. Could be called anything. Could be called __ invoke, which is even more awesome. But that's the method. You configure SimpleBus which method to call, and that's the one that is default. And then there's a constructor, because in this case we probably need some way to calculate how many miles is in a flight, and we probably need, well, we do need our command bus. So just a constructor and setting dependencies, that's just regular dependency injection. And then in the notify method we calculate the number of miles, we create a command to add miles to members account, and then we send that out on the command bus. Simple enough. This is what the command looks like, add miles to members account. Again, just regular PHP class. I think you're beginning to get the sort of gist of what I'm going for here. It's quite simple, just regular objects, and SimpleBus just connects them together. Command handlers look very similar to the previous one here, except you probably want to name them differently. That's it. So that's pretty much all I had about messages and commands and events. Another interesting pattern in your domain code that we're using with some clients, it's very cool, and we'd like to use it more, and we're probably going to use it more, is the specification pattern. One of the libraries that we're using is called rulerz, and we'd like, well, this is under trial. We're using it with one client currently. We're soon going to be using it for 2 clients, and it's been working great so far. So the specification pattern, I mean, you've all seen something like this. Like when you have a SQL database, you select all the members where status is gold. This is pretty much something like this is probably in any web application. There's few web applications that do not have something like this. Sadly, it's not very object-oriented, and it ties, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great for getting data from a SQL database, but it does tie your code. If you have that particular SQL statement, that ties your code to both the database engine and your database schema. So it does tie your code, and imagine having to implement something like a rules engine when you have to create basically SQL for it. Some people might actually have done that. What's a rules engine? Well, you all know iTunes, I presume. iTunes has this awesome feature called Smart Album or Smart Playlist, where you set conditions in a user interface, and that creates a playlist, and it gets automatically updated. It's a really neat feature, and basically a lot of applications could benefit from having a rule builder. And that's basically what this is. This builds the rules for that particular playlist. And imagine, has anyone considered implementing something like this? How many people have implemented something like this? Was it horrible? Yes. I imagine so. So basically, the specification pattern allows you to do this. It's not going to be a dance on roses, but it's that's probably a Swedishism. But it's going to be easier. It's going to be a little bit simpler. So basically, what the specification pattern does is it allows you to use specification objects. So the first one is pretty simple. So you have a member repository, and you have a find matching method. That find matching method takes a specification. In this case, the specification is that is a class denoting the specification for being a gold member. And this is just an object. That's not too difficult to transform something you get from the user interface to. If you want to do something a bit more complex, you have the AND X or X or not specifications, which makes it possible to chain them in different ways. So the bottom statement here is find basically all members who are gold members and whose language is Swedish, who have been on a flight within the last 7 days, but have only been members of the frequent flyers program for less than a year. This is something that could definitely come out of a rules engine, because say you want to send an email to these particular customers. It's fine writing code like this. It's less fine actually creating an interface for business people to select these people. And the specification pattern, basically you have, this is the code that you'll be able to run. The specification class, in the case of ruler Z, has another query language in it. It's pretty simple to map to that. And then you create an executor for whatever you're using. So what's interesting about ruler Z is this works equally well if your repository is a Doctrine ORM or an Elasticsearch database. It's not the right word, an Elasticsearch index, or if it's just an array of PHP objects. All of this is going to be easily implementable. And if you're using something like the Symfony form component, actually creating these different specifications is going to be quite a bit simpler than having to create your own custom SQL. Not to mention that it's going to be a lot more secure, because creating custom SQL from user input tends to have risks. Let's put it that way. It's risky, risky business. So back to web frameworks. Like I said earlier, a web framework is basically, the way we see it, it's basically a way to integrate your domain code into the web. And a controller takes an HTTP request and it returns an HTTP response. That's the basics for HTTP kernel. It's basically the basics of any web application. It's the basics for PSR7 as well. And this should be thinly glued to your domain. Your domain code should not have any dependencies on your web framework. That's going about things the opposite, the odd way around. Of course, there's exceptions to those rules. Modern frameworks, like I said, are many things. Symfony is a web framework, but I mean, the web framework parts of Symfony is really only just HTTP kernel and HTTP foundation. There's some web-related components like security and form. There's some glue components like dependency injection, and then there's the miscellaneous components like YAML or LDAP. And yes, depending on like the miscellaneous components, that's not a big deal. I mean, if you need to parse YAML, it's perfectly fine to depend on Symfony's YAML parser for that. No need to go about rewriting it just because it starts with Symfony and Symfony as a framework. However, you should not be depending on, for example, the HTTP kernel or HTTP foundation in your domain code, because unless your domain is actually HTTP responses and requests, that's not the way to go about it. So in Symfony, at least, I don't know what it is in other frameworks, but I assume there's some sort of similar concept. We have the concept of a bundle, which basically integrates a library into the framework. Your domain code is that library. So your bundle, which you do need to have, is going to be integrating your domain code into the framework. One of the chief responsibilities of a Symfony bundle is to set up dependency injection. And there's been a lot of talk on these particular meetups about dependency injection and the evils of dependency injection. And there's been a lot of talk everywhere about that, actually. There's plenty of people who do not like dependency injection for several reasons, specifically dependency injection containers. And the reason people tend to not like dependency injection containers is that some people use dependency injection containers as service locators. So a service locator is basically, if you're using a dependency injection container, you inject that into your service, and then you say, well, give me this service, or give me this service. That sort of defeats the purpose of dependency injection containers, and it also makes your, well, it's not good. Let's put it that way. Don't do that. So do not use the dependency injection container as a service locator. I'm serious.
Flexible.
I'll get to that in the next slide. So separate your domain code and your bundle. Your domain code should know nothing about your dependency injection container. Most of your bundle should also know nothing about your dependency injection container. I mean, the bundle extension, which is what creates or configures the dependency injection container for your bundle, obviously needs to know about the dependency injection container. And a compiler pass obviously needs to know about that. And sometimes, if you're doing fancy things, you might have to do some sort of lazy loading, which should know about your dependency injection container. That should be an exception, not the rule. And this is sort of where we come into the problem of not all of the tips I'm going to give you here is great for every project. The Symfony base controller is not a good example of how to write good code, because the Symfony base controller hands you the dependency injection container and says, here, go crazy. That's not a good thing. It's, in fact, exactly what you should not be doing with your dependency injection controller. But it does have some slight advantages. It's actually, for small projects, it's not a problem. But because the issue here is really that if you're teaching somebody to use Symfony, and they're not used to developing solid applications, they're not used to handle dependency injection at all, it's gonna be much easier to teach them if you're using something like a service locator, because that means you can focus on what you're actually trying to teach them instead of writing boilerplate code. So there's fewer concepts to keep in mind, but the controller base class is not a good role model. You should not be, in a larger project, you should be moving away from it. And luckily, it's optional to use. You can just define your controllers as services and just inject the dependencies you need, which should be something like a command bus, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, it's optional. And for smaller projects, fine. Just don't go crazy. And this is where I wanted to do the demo, but I've already used at least 40 minutes, so we're sadly going to have to skip the demo and move straight to questions. Are there any questions?
Just a few weeks ago, since your labs announced that they moved to the Dear search to the Algolia search basically.
Come again?
Algolia.
Yeah?
Yeah, so how would you compare the Algolia versus Elastic versus Solar?
I have not used Algolia. We're comparing to Solar I mean, Elasticsearch is in many cases better than Solar because it's more easy to configure at runtime. You don't actually have large config files that you need to change whenever you're changing your data. Algolia I don't have any experience with. Anyone else? Yes.
How approximately it is to make like time right tests with features in percentage?
I'm sorry?
How much it takes to write unit and BDD tests?
So, so your question is basically how much longer is it going to take to be developing using BDD, whereas not using BDD? I don't actually have any time measurements for it. The thing about using something like specifications is you're getting a whole lot more than just tested code, and I would assume that, I mean, if you were to compare somebody just diving into writing a class and they know exactly what they're going to write, yeah, that's probably going to be faster than writing a specification for what the class is going to do and then doing what it's going to do. But usually that's not the case, and whenever you find a bug or something, that's definitely not the case. So at a longer term perspective, I would say that it's definitely faster to use BDD. But in a short-term perspective, yeah, that might be the case. That it's not as fast as if you're diving in directly, knowing exactly what you're going to do. But I don't think that's the case very often, that you know exactly how you're going to implement a problem, and that's where specifications actually help you decide how to do that, and that's a big strength, really, in my opinion.
I'm just feeling that, like, if you want to cover all the possible cases, it might just eat all the possible budget.
Well, usually you wouldn't. I mean, you would cover the case. You would cover the case as you see fit. You wouldn't. I mean, it's a specification for what a class is supposed to be able to do. So if you have a frequent flyer miles calculator, it's supposed to be able to calculate the number of miles in a flight. And that's what it's supposed to be able to do. And maybe there's some weird special cases which you have to take into account. But a lot of times your specifications shouldn't be more than just a couple of methods saying what the class is supposed to do. If there's a bug, you can add more specifications, obviously, but you can't expect to cover everything initially. Basically, PHP spec isn't a testing tool, it's a design tool. So it's made to let you design your classes better. And it has the additional bonus of making it tested. So that's really keeping that in mind will really help you get into the right mindset. It's a design tool, it's not a testing tool.
But if you already jump into big existing project without that,
then it's probably difficult to refactor to PHP spec. It's not impossible, but it's probably, depending on the code, it's going to be more or less difficult. If the code is already very solid, that's not a problem, because then you will be able to write specifications for it. But usually you would have to refactor your code in order to fit sort of the model that PHP spec advocates. And that's going to take as long as refactoring any code to fit anything. Yes?
What you have told us about is how you work in a perfect world.
Yes.
And I figure different aspects of this are different important to you. So, which ones would you never enter a project if you can't bring them with you?
Solid. And that's actually something I didn't touch too much upon here. But if the code isn't already solid and it's not going to be worked towards being solid, I wouldn't enter that project because that's just going to be a pain. So that's the underlying principle, really. Anyone else? Cool. So if you need to get in touch, I'm Dr. Rotmus on Twitter. I also have email. Everyone does, I think. If you want help with this, we're a consultancy, so you can just give me a call. And you can also check out our website, which is, I'm pretty sure, pretty unhackable because it's a static page. So that's pretty much it.